Hello and welcome to Night Historian. Tonight we examine 5 port cities that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Alexandria, Acre, Aden, Hormuz and Calicut were far more than commercial hubs. They functioned as theatres of power, where competing empires, religions and merchant networks clashed over control of the world's most valuable resources. Before we proceed, I request 2 things. If this narrative resonates with you, subscribe. Your support determines whether these stories reach others. Second, I would appreciate knowing where you listen and at what time. Share your location and hour in the comments below. I read every response. Now extinguish the lights around you. Release your attention from the present moment. What follows is an examination of how geography, trade, and human ambition constructed systems of dominance that persist in recognizable form today. A port functions as a mechanism of power. Understanding these 5 mechanisms reveals truths about how authority operates, how it fractures, and why certain locations matter more than others in determining the fate of nations and peoples. Alexandria occupied a position of extraordinary geographic advantage. The city sat at the mouth of the Nile River, where it emptied into the Mediterranean Sea, creating a natural junction between inland waterways and oceanic trade routes. This location meant that goods flowing down from the African interior could transfer directly onto merchant vessels bound for Europe, Asia Minor, and the Levantine coast. The harbour itself consisted of 2 main basins separated by a causeway, allowing simultaneous operations on different scales. Larger vessels anchored in the outer harbour, while smaller craft manoeuvred through the inner channels where freshwater supplies and repair facilities concentrated. The daily rhythm of the port reflected this dual nature. At dawn, dock workers moved through predetermined patterns established over centuries of operation. Some teams managed the unloading of grain shipments from Upper Egypt, stacking sacks with mechanical efficiency. Other crews attended to the more delicate work of handling spices, silks and glassware that required careful storage to prevent damage. The Pharos lighthouse stood visible from considerable distances at sea, its beacon guiding navigators through the night hours and serving as a constant reminder of the city's permanence and authority. Within the harbour district, multiple communities maintained separate quarters while conducting business in overlapping spaces. Venetian merchants occupied one section, their warehouses marked by distinctive architectural styles and their own administrative structures. Genoese traders operated from a different quarter, maintaining competitive distance from their Venetian counterparts despite their shared Christian faith. Jewish merchants controlled significant portions of the grain trade and textile commerce, their networks extending eastward toward the Red Sea and southward along African coastlines. Muslim traders, both Arab and Persian, managed the spice imports and luxury goods flowing from the Indian Ocean. These communities coexisted not through ideological harmony, but through mutual economic necessity and carefully negotiated boundaries. The customs house functioned as the central mechanism through which all this activity moved. Officials employed by the ruling authority, whether Mamluk administrators or earlier Byzantine governors, inspected every significant cargo. Scribes recorded transactions in ledgers that tracked both the goods and the taxes owed. This bureaucratic apparatus extracted wealth from commerce without disrupting its flow. Merchants anticipated these costs and factored them into their pricing calculations. The system worked because it remained predictable. A merchant arriving with a shipment of pepper knew precisely what percentage would transfer to state coffers, what fees would support harbour maintenance, and what portion remained as profit. The physical infrastructure supporting this commerce required constant maintenance. Docks needed regular repair as salt water and heavy use degraded wooden structures. Warehouses required vigilant management against fire, theft, and spoilage. The freshwater systems that supplied both the city and visiting ships demanded investment in wells and cisterns. Slave labour provided much of the muscle for these operations, though free workers also performed skilled tasks like carpentry, rope making, and sail repair. The harbour economy supported an entire class of people whose livelihoods depended on the continuous movement of goods. Communication networks radiated outward from Alexandria's harbour in multiple directions. Merchants maintained correspondence with trading partners in Venice, Genoa, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and ports along the Indian coast. These letters travelled on the same ships that carried merchandise, creating information networks that moved at the pace of maritime commerce. A merchant learning of a pepper shortage in Europe might immediately arrange for increased shipments from the Red Sea. News of political instability in a distant region could prompt merchants to redirect their investments toward more stable markets. The harbour functioned not just as a physical space, but as a node in a communication system that connected the Mediterranean world to Asia. The human dimension of harbour life extended beyond the merchants and officials. Thousands of people depended on port activity for survival. Dock workers earned wages sufficient for basic subsistence, but vulnerable to seasonal fluctuations in trade. Women worked as laundresses, cooks, and sex workers, serving the transient population of sailors and merchants. Children ran errands, carried messages, and learned trades through apprenticeship. Enslaved people performed the most dangerous and degrading labour, loading heavy cargo in extreme heat and handling materials that caused injury and disease. The social hierarchy reflected economic power, with wealthy merchants occupying the highest positions and enslaved workers at the bottom, yet all remained bound within a system that required their participation. The harbour's rhythm followed patterns established by nature and commerce working in concert. Monsoon winds determined when ships could safely travel to and from the Red Sea. The Nile's flood cycle affected grain availability and therefore the volume of exports. Seasonal patterns in demand for particular goods meant that certain times of year brought intense activity, while other periods saw reduced operations. Merchants learned to anticipate these cycles and adjust their strategies accordingly. A trader might stockpile grain during harvest season, knowing that prices would rise during months when new crops had not yet matured. This knowledge represented accumulated wisdom passed through merchant families across generations. Religious observance structured time within the harbour district in ways that affected commerce. The call to prayer interrupted daily work 5 times, requiring Muslim merchants and workers to pause for devotion. Christian merchants attended services on designated days. Jewish merchants observed the Sabbath, which meant reduced activity from Friday evening through Saturday. These religious practices created rhythms that non-believers learned to accommodate. A Christian merchant conducting business with a Muslim trader understood that certain hours would be unavailable for negotiation. This accommodation reflected not tolerance in the modern sense, but rather pragmatic recognition that commerce required working across religious boundaries. The harbour's position as a crossroads meant that information flowed through it constantly. News of wars, famines, political changes, and technological innovations arrived through merchant networks and travelling scholars. Alexandria received reports of events in distant lands months after they occurred. Yet this delayed information still shaped decisions about trade routes and investment strategies. Merchants learned to interpret these reports, distinguishing between rumours that might affect prices and substantive changes that required strategic adjustment. The harbour functioned as a processing centre where information from across the known world concentrated, mixed, and dispersed again through outgoing merchants. The Pharos lighthouse represented more than a navigational aid. It symbolised Alexandria's permanence and the authority that controlled the harbour. The structure's visibility from great distances meant that approaching merchants recognised their destination long before entering port. The lighthouse required constant maintenance and staffing, representing a significant investment of resources by whatever power controlled the city. Its presence communicated that this harbour was organised, managed, and worth the effort to reach. For merchants, the sight of the pharaohs meant they had navigated successfully to one of the world's most important commercial centers. For rulers, maintaining the lighthouse demonstrated their commitment to facilitating commerce and extracting its benefits. But a harbour's true power lay not in what arrived, but in what it represented to those who controlled it. Alexandria's position made it invaluable to any authority seeking to dominate Mediterranean trade. This value would eventually attract the attention of forces far more aggressive than the merchant communities that had coexisted within its quarters for centuries. Pepper arrived in Alexandria from the Malabar coast of India, travelling through the Red Sea in vessels that required months to complete the journey. A single pound of pepper cost more than a labourer earned in a month. In European markets, the price multiplied further, sometimes reaching 10 times the amount paid at the point of origin. This disparity between production cost and final sale price created the economic engine that drove Mediterranean commerce. Merchants understood that pepper represented not merely a commodity, but concentrated wealth that could be transported in relatively small volumes. A ship carrying 50 tons of pepper could generate profits equivalent to hundreds of tons of grain. The spice trade operated on principles fundamentally different from bulk commodity commerce. Grain moved in massive quantities at relatively low profit margins per unit. A merchant dealing in grain required significant capital to purchase large shipments, but the returns per transaction remained modest. Spices operated inversely. A merchant needed less capital to purchase pepper, cloves, or nutmeg, yet each transaction generated substantial profit. This economic structure meant that spice merchants occupied a different social position than grain traders. They accumulated wealth more rapidly and could afford to take greater risks on individual ventures. Silk represented another category of high-value goods that flowed through Alexandria's markets. The fabric originated in China, where imperial monopolies controlled production and export. Silk reached Mediterranean ports through overland routes that passed through Central Asia and the Middle East, or through maritime routes that travelled around India and across the Arabian Sea. The journey consumed months regardless of the path chosen. Silk's value derived partly from its scarcity and partly from its genuine utility for wealthy consumers who valued its durability and appearance. A bolt of fine silk could command prices comparable to pepper, yet the two goods served entirely different purposes in the economies that consumed them. Glass production in Egypt itself created another category of valuable exports. Alexandrian glassmakers produced vessels and decorative objects that found markets throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The craft required specialized knowledge, passed through family lineages and guild structures. A master glassmaker commanded respect and compensation, reflecting the difficulty of the work. Glass represented a different economic model than spices or silk. It could not be produced anywhere with equal quality, which meant that Egyptian glass maintained consistent demand. Unlike spices, which could be sourced from multiple origins, glass created a form of monopoly based on technical expertise rather than geographic accident. The taxation systems governing these goods reflected their different values and characteristics. Spices faced higher tax rates than grain because they generated greater profits, and merchants could absorb the costs. Glass exports supported local artisans, so rulers sometimes imposed lower taxes to encourage production and maintain employment. Grain faced moderate taxation because it represented the foundation of food security, and excessive taxation could provoke social instability. These differentiated tax rates represented sophisticated economic understanding by administrators who recognized that uniform taxation would distort markets and reduce overall revenue. Cotton textiles from India arrived in Alexandria in large quantities, serving both local consumption and re-export to Mediterranean markets. The fabric's utility for clothing and household purposes meant that demand remained relatively stable across seasons and economic conditions. Unlike spices, which represented luxury consumption vulnerable to economic downturns, cotton maintained steady demand even during periods of reduced prosperity. Merchants dealing in textiles operated on different principles than spice traders. They required larger capital investments to purchase sufficient quantities to justify shipping costs, but they faced more predictable demand patterns. The movement of goods through Alexandria created hierarchies among merchants based on their access to particular commodities. A merchant with connections to spice suppliers in India occupied a different position than one dealing primarily in grain. Spice merchants could afford larger warehouses, employ more staff, and take greater risks on speculative ventures. Grain merchants operated on narrower margins but served a more essential function in the city's economy. This differentiation meant that the merchant community itself stratified into distinct classes with different interests and different relationships to political authority. Women participated in commerce through family enterprises, though their roles varied by commodity and social class. Wives of wealthier spice merchants might manage warehouses and conduct transactions on their husband's behalf during their absences. Women from merchant families sometimes inherited trading rights and operated independently as widows. In textile commerce, women worked as spinners, weavers, and dyers, transforming raw materials into finished goods. The most economically vulnerable women worked as porters, carrying goods through the harbour district in exchange for minimal compensation. Gender did not prevent participation in commerce, but it determined the types of work available and the compensation received. The storage of goods required careful management to prevent spoilage and loss. Spices needed protection from moisture and insects, which meant that warehouses had to maintain specific environmental conditions. Grain required protection from rodents and fungal growth, necessitating regular inspection and turning of stored supplies. Silk and textiles needed protection from light exposure and pest damage. Glass required careful stacking to prevent breakage. These different requirements meant that specialized warehouses developed for different commodity types. A merchant could not simply store spices in the same facility as grain without risking contamination and loss. This specialization created opportunities for warehouse owners to extract fees from merchants requiring storage services. Insurance mechanisms developed to manage the risks inherent in maritime commerce. Merchants recognized that ships sometimes sank, cargoes sometimes spoiled, and routes sometimes became impassable due to political instability. Rather than accepting these losses individually, merchants developed systems where multiple traders contributed to a fund that compensated those who experienced losses. These early insurance arrangements operated on principles of mutual aid rather than formal contracts, yet they functioned effectively enough to encourage merchants to undertake longer voyages and larger shipments. The existence of insurance mechanisms meant that merchants could calculate risk more precisely and make investment decisions based on expected returns rather than worst-case scenarios. The value of goods determined their treatment throughout the supply chain. Spices received careful handling because their high value meant that even small losses represented significant financial impact. Grain, despite its essential nature, received rougher treatment because individual units held minimal value. A labourer might spill some grain while loading a ship without causing serious economic consequences. The same labourer spilling pepper would face severe punishment because the loss represented substantial wealth. This differential treatment reflected economic logic rather than any inherent respect for particular commodities. Merchants and administrators understood that resources should be allocated according to the value at stake. The accumulation of goods in Alexandria's warehouses created visual evidence of the city's commercial importance. Merchants visiting the harbour could observe the scale of operations and assess market conditions by examining inventory levels. High inventory suggested weak demand or supply disruptions that might create opportunities for speculation. Low inventory suggested strong demand and potential shortages. Experienced merchants learned to interpret these physical signs and adjust their strategies accordingly. The warehouses themselves became landmarks that newcomers used to navigate the harbour district and locate specific merchants or trading communities. Yet goods alone did not determine a port's fate. The people who moved them and the beliefs they carried shaped everything that followed. Religious boundaries divided the merchant community in ways that created both cooperation and tension. Alexandria's merchant communities maintained separate residential and commercial quarters despite their constant interaction in the harbour district. The Venetian Fondaco occupied a specific location with its own warehouses, administrative offices, and living quarters for merchants and their families. Genoese traders operated from a different section, maintaining competitive distance from their Venetian rivals even as both groups conducted business in overlapping markets. Jewish merchants controlled significant portions of the grain trade and textile commerce, their networks extending through the Mediterranean and into the Indian Ocean. Muslim traders, both Arab and Persian, managed the spice imports and luxury goods flowing from distant ports. These spatial separations reflected not merely preference, but legal and religious requirements that governed how different communities could interact. The Fondaco system itself represented a compromise between commercial necessity and religious restriction. These establishments functioned as fortified compounds where foreign merchants could conduct business, store goods, and reside without requiring integration into the local population. The Fondaco provided security for merchants far from home, protection for their merchandise, and a space where they could maintain their own religious practices and dietary customs. In exchange, the merchant communities accepted restrictions on their movements and acknowledged the authority of local rulers. A Venetian merchant in Alexandria could not simply move freely throughout the city. Movement outside the Fondaco required permission, and certain areas remained entirely off-limits to foreign merchants regardless of their commercial importance. Religious law created practical constraints on commerce that merchants learned to navigate through experience and negotiation. Islamic law prohibited the charging of interest on loans, which meant that Muslim merchants developed alternative financial instruments to accomplish similar economic functions. A Muslim lender might purchase goods from a merchant at a discount, then sell them back at a higher price, effectively charging interest while maintaining technical compliance with religious law. Christian merchants, operating under different theological constraints, employed different financial mechanisms. Jewish merchants maintained their own legal traditions regarding usury and contracts, which sometimes aligned with Islamic principles and sometimes diverged. These different legal frameworks meant that merchants from different religious communities could not always conduct business using identical contractual arrangements. Food laws created visible boundaries within the harbour district. Muslim merchants required halal meat slaughtered according to Islamic practice. Jewish merchants required kosher meat prepared according to Jewish law. Christian merchants followed their own dietary practices. This meant that separate butchers, bakers, and food vendors operated within each community's quarter. The smell of different cooking methods and spice combinations marked the boundaries between neighbourhoods as clearly as any physical barrier. A merchant walking through the harbour district could identify which community occupied each section through olfactory cues before encountering any visual markers. Prayer times structured the daily rhythm of commerce in ways that required accommodation from all parties. The Islamic call to prayer occurred 5 times daily at specific times determined by the sun's position. When the call sounded, Muslim merchants and workers paused their activities for prayer. Christian merchants understood this pattern and adjusted their business hours accordingly. A Christian merchant seeking to negotiate with a Muslim counterpart learned to avoid initiating important discussions during prayer times. This accommodation reflected not religious respect in the modern sense, but rather pragmatic recognition that commerce required working across religious boundaries. Disrupting someone's religious observance would damage the relationship necessary for future transactions. the Sabbath created a weekly rhythm that affected commerce differently. Jewish merchants ceased work from Friday evening through Saturday, making themselves unavailable for business during this period. Muslim merchants observed Friday as a holy day, but continued working on Saturday and Sunday. Christian merchants operated on a different weekly cycle. These overlapping but non-identical religious calendars meant that the harbour district never completely ceased activity. When Jewish merchants rested, Muslim and Christian traders continued operations. When Christians observed their holy days, Muslim and Jewish merchants remained available for commerce. This continuous operation reflected the economic reality that no single religious community could monopolize the harbour's function. Intermarriage between communities occurred despite religious prohibitions, creating families with mixed religious heritage. A Christian merchant might marry a Muslim woman, producing children whose religious identity remained ambiguous. Jewish merchants sometimes married into Christian families. These unions created practical problems for religious authorities who insisted on strict separation. Yet they also created networks of kinship that transcended religious boundaries. A merchant with relatives in multiple religious communities could access information and credit networks that pure co-religionists could not reach. This kinship-based advantage sometimes motivated families to accept the religious complications of intermarriage. Conversion served economic purposes as well as spiritual ones. A merchant converting from Christianity to Islam could access Muslim trading networks and credit relationships that remained closed to non-believers. Conversion also simplified legal relationships with Muslim authorities and reduced the restrictions on movement and commerce. Some merchants converted strategically, maintaining private adherence to their original faith while publicly observing the requirements of their adopted religion. Others converted sincerely, finding genuine spiritual meaning in their new faith. The motivations varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Religious identity carried economic consequences that merchants sometimes chose to modify. Slavery complicated the religious boundaries in ways that merchants and authorities struggled to manage. Enslaved people came from various religious backgrounds, including Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Islamic law permitted the enslavement of non-believers, but theoretically prohibited the enslavement of fellow Muslims. Christian law permitted the enslavement of non-Christians. Jewish law contained complex provisions regarding slavery. In practice, these legal distinctions often blurred. Merchants purchased enslaved people regardless of their religious background and employed them in whatever capacity generated profit. An enslaved Christian might work in a Muslim merchant's warehouse. An enslaved Muslim might labor for a Christian trader. Religious law provided frameworks for these arrangements, but economic necessity often overrode strict legal compliance. The merchant communities maintained their own legal systems parallel to the official courts of Alexandria. A dispute between two Venetian merchants would typically be resolved through Venetian courts rather than local authorities. Jewish merchants appealed to Jewish judges for commercial disputes. Muslim merchants followed Islamic legal procedures. This parallel legal system created efficiency by allowing merchants to resolve disputes according to familiar law and custom. It also created a form of autonomy that foreign merchants valued highly. They could conduct business according to their own legal traditions rather than submitting entirely to local authority. Rulers tolerated this arrangement because it simplified administration and encouraged merchants to settle in their ports. Trust operated differently across religious boundaries than within communities. A merchant trusted a co-religionist more readily than a merchant from a different faith, all else being equal. This preference reflected both cultural familiarity and the existence of shared legal and religious frameworks for resolving disputes. Yet commerce required trust across these boundaries, which meant that merchants developed mechanisms to extend trust to outsiders. Reputation networks operated across religious lines. A merchant known for honest dealing in one community could leverage that reputation in another. Merchants sometimes employed intermediaries from neutral communities to facilitate transactions between groups that viewed each other with suspicion. These mechanisms allowed commerce to function, despite religious tension. The harbour's commercial success depended on maintaining these invisible boundaries while allowing sufficient interaction for trade to occur. Merchants from different communities competed fiercely for market share, yet cooperated in maintaining the systems that made commerce possible. This balance remained stable as long as external forces did not disrupt the established arrangements. When those forces arrived, the boundaries that had seemed permanent would prove fragile. These invisible lines held firm until external forces arrived with the intention of redrawing them entirely. Acre would become the battleground where those redrawings occurred. Acre occupied a position on the Levantine coast that made it strategically invaluable to any power seeking to control Mediterranean trade and communication with the interior of the Levant. The harbour provided shelter from storms and sufficient depth for large merchant vessels. The city's location allowed access to overland routes connecting to Damascus, Baghdad, and the interior trade networks of the Middle East. When Crusader forces conquered Acre in 1104, they recognized immediately that this port represented the key to maintaining their presence in the Holy Land. The conquest transformed Acre from a secondary port into the capital of the Crusader state, known as Outremer, and the city's fortifications expanded dramatically over the following centuries. The Crusader administration implemented a fundamentally different system of governance than the merchant-dominated networks that characterized Alexandria. Military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, controlled significant portions of the city's wealth and military capacity. These organizations combined religious devotion with sophisticated financial operations and military discipline. The Templars maintained banking functions that allowed merchants to deposit funds in one location and withdraw them in another, facilitating long-distance commerce while generating profit through exchange fees. The Hospitallers controlled fortifications and maintained naval vessels that protected shipping lanes. Both orders extracted substantial revenues from commerce while pursuing military objectives that sometimes conflicted with merchant interests. The fortification system surrounding Acre reflected the reality of constant military threat. Double and triple walls protected the harbour district, with towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The walls incorporated sophisticated design principles developed through centuries of siege warfare. Defenders could rain projectiles on attackers from multiple angles simultaneously, making frontal assault extraordinarily costly. The fortifications required constant maintenance and garrison troops, representing a significant drain on resources. Yet rulers accepted these costs because the walls provided security that made commerce possible. Merchants would not invest in a port city vulnerable to sudden conquest or destruction. Taxation under Crusader rule operated differently than in Alexandria's merchant-dominated system. The military orders extracted revenues to support their operations, creating a tax burden that sometimes exceeded what merchants considered sustainable. A merchant arriving with a shipment of spices faced not merely the standard customs duties, but additional levies supporting military operations. These increased taxes reduced profit margins and sometimes motivated merchants to redirect their trade toward ports with lower tax rates. The Crusader administration struggled to balance the need for military revenue with the economic reality that excessive taxation could drive commerce elsewhere. The local population, under Crusader rule, experienced the port's transformation as a form of occupation. Muslim merchants who had previously dominated Acre's trade networks found themselves marginalized or expelled. Christian merchants from Europe received preferential treatment and access to markets. Local craftspeople and laborers continued working, but under new authority structures that prioritized military objectives over commercial efficiency. The shift in power meant that wealth flowed differently through the city. Profits that previously enriched Muslim merchants now enriched Crusader military orders and European traders. This redistribution of wealth created resentment among the displaced population and instability that periodically erupted into violence. Slavery flourished in Crusader Acre as a mechanism for obtaining labor and generating revenue. The Crusaders captured Muslim prisoners during military campaigns and sold them into slavery. Christian merchants purchased enslaved people to work in warehouses, on docks, and in households. The slave markets of Acre functioned openly, with prices determined by age, health, and perceived capability. Enslaved people from various backgrounds, Muslim, Jewish, and occasionally Christian, worked alongside free labourers in the harbour district. The existence of slavery created a permanent underclass whose labour supported the entire commercial system while receiving no compensation beyond minimal subsistence. The relationship between the military orders and the merchant republics of Venice and Genoa created constant tension within Crusader Acre. Both Venetian and Genoese merchants maintained significant trading operations in the city and sought to expand their influence. The military orders viewed merchants with suspicion, recognizing that commercial interests sometimes conflicted with military objectives. Merchants, in turn, resented the military orders' taxation and their tendency to prioritize military operations over trade facilitation. These tensions occasionally erupted into open conflict, with merchant factions fighting military forces in the streets. The Crusader administration struggled to maintain order while accommodating both military and commercial interests. The underground water systems of Acre represented critical infrastructure that supported both the civilian population and military operations. Wells and cisterns provided fresh water essential for survival during sieges when external water sources became inaccessible. The Crusaders invested significant resources in maintaining and expanding these systems, recognizing that water security determined whether the city could withstand prolonged assault. The location and capacity of these water systems influenced military strategy, as controlling them provided advantages in siege situations. Defenders understood that enemies seeking to starve the city of water could force surrender without requiring direct military assault. Religious diversity within Crusader Acre created complications for administrators attempting to maintain order. Christian merchants and soldiers dominated the city, yet Muslim and Jewish populations remained significant. The Crusaders imposed restrictions on these populations, limiting their movement and commercial activities. Muslim merchants faced particular suspicion as potential security threats. Jewish merchants occupied an ambiguous position, neither fully trusted by Christian authorities nor fully accepted by the Muslim population. These restrictions created inefficiencies in commerce by limiting the participation of merchants with established networks in Muslim and Jewish trading communities. Yet security concerns sometimes overrode economic efficiency in Crusader decision-making. The harbour's physical transformation under Crusader rule reflected military priorities. Docks were redesigned to facilitate the rapid loading and unloading of military supplies. Warehouses were constructed to store weapons, armour, and provisions for the garrison. The layout prioritized military logistics over merchant convenience. This reorganization meant that Acre's harbour became less efficient for commercial operations than it had been under previous regimes. Merchants sometimes complained about the difficulty of accessing warehouses or the delays caused by military operations taking priority. Yet merchants accepted these inefficiencies because the alternative was losing access to the port entirely. The Crusader presence in Acre lasted nearly 2 centuries, creating a generation of merchants who knew no other political system. Families of Venetian and Genoese traders established themselves in the city, creating permanent communities with deep roots. These merchants developed relationships with local craftspeople and labourers, creating networks that transcended the formal divisions between conquerors and conquered. Children born in Acre to European merchant families sometimes learned Arabic and developed cultural familiarity with the local population. Yet this cultural integration never translated into political integration. The fundamental reality remained that Crusader military authority rested on force, and that force could be withdrawn or overcome. The economic system that developed in Crusader Acre depended entirely on maintaining military superiority over surrounding Muslim forces. As long as the Crusaders could defend the city against assault, commerce continued and profits flowed. The moment military superiority shifted, the entire system became vulnerable. Merchants understood this reality and maintained contingency plans for rapid departure. Valuable merchandise could be loaded onto ships within hours. Families maintained property in multiple ports, allowing them to relocate if Acre fell. This contingency planning reflected the merchants' understanding that their presence in Acre depended on military circumstances beyond their control. When Acre fell to Mamluk forces in 1291, the Crusader experiment in the Levant effectively ended. The competition for port control did not cease, however. It merely shifted southward, where the Indian Ocean offered even greater wealth and where the balance of power between merchants and military authorities remained less settled. South of the Levantine coast, the Red Sea and Arabian Sea created a different kind of maritime world governed by monsoon winds rather than Mediterranean currents. Aden occupied the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, controlling access from the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. Hormuz sat at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, commanding the narrow passage through which all Gulf trade necessarily flowed. These two ports functioned as gatekeepers controlling the movement of goods between the Mediterranean world and the Indian subcontinent. The monsoon winds that dominated this region created a seasonal rhythm fundamentally different from Mediterranean commerce. Ships could not navigate these waters during certain months, when storms made sailing extraordinarily dangerous. Merchants learned to time their voyages according to wind patterns, departing ports when conditions favoured their destination, and waiting in harbour when conditions made travel impossible. Aden's position made it invaluable to whatever power controlled it. The city sat on a peninsula surrounded by water on three sides, providing natural defensive advantages. The harbour itself offered excellent shelter from storms, and freshwater sources in the surrounding region supported a substantial population. Merchants arriving from the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf understood that Aden represented a necessary stopping point. Ships could not travel directly from the Red Sea to India without refueling and resupplying. Aden provided these services, extracting substantial fees in exchange. The Rasulid dynasty controlled Aden during much of the medieval period, maintaining a sophisticated administrative system that collected taxes on all goods passing through the port. The Rasulids understood that their wealth depended on facilitating commerce rather than disrupting it, and they invested in harbour infrastructure and security to encourage merchants to use their port. Hormuz controlled a different but equally strategic position. The Persian Gulf contained some of the world's richest trading networks, with goods flowing from Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia converging at the Gulf's entrance. All this commerce necessarily passed through the narrow straits separating Hormuz from the Arabian coast. A ruler controlling Hormuz could extract taxes from every merchant seeking to access Gulf trade. The strategic importance of Hormuz attracted the attention of multiple powers over centuries. Persian rulers, Arab dynasties, and eventually Portuguese conquerors all sought to control this critical choke point. The port changed hands repeatedly as different powers rose and fell, yet its fundamental economic importance remained constant. The taxation systems in these southern ports reflected their role as choke points rather than primary markets. Unlike Alexandria, which taxed goods based on their value and the services provided, Aden and Hormuz extracted transit fees simply for allowing goods to pass through. A merchant with a shipment of spices paid a fee to Aden merely for the privilege of entering the harbour and continuing southward. The same merchant paid another fee to Hormuz for passing through the strait. These transit fees represented pure extraction with minimal corresponding service provision. Merchants accepted these costs because alternatives did not exist. A merchant seeking to trade with India could not simply avoid these ports. The geography made them mandatory stopping points. The spice monopoly that these ports helped maintain created extraordinary wealth for those who controlled them. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and mace originated in specific regions of the Indian Ocean, primarily the Spice Islands east of India. These spices could not be cultivated in the Mediterranean world or the Middle East. This geographic monopoly meant that whoever controlled the trade routes connecting the Spice Islands to Mediterranean markets could extract enormous profits. Aden and Hormuz functioned as critical nodes in this monopoly system. Merchants purchasing spices in India had to transport them through one of these ports to reach Mediterranean markets. The port authorities understood their leverage and used it to extract maximum revenue. Naval warfare and piracy complicated commerce in these waters in ways that Mediterranean ports did not experience to the same degree. The Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf contain numerous islands and coastal regions where pirates could shelter. Merchant ships travelling between ports faced constant risk of attack. Some piracy reflected organised operations by rulers seeking to extract wealth through force rather than taxation. Other piracy involved independent operators seeking personal profit. Merchants responded by travelling in convoys, grouping multiple ships together for mutual defence. The convoy system increased security but reduced efficiency by forcing faster ships to travel at the pace of slower vessels. Insurance mechanisms developed to compensate merchants who lost cargo to pirates, though these insurance arrangements operated on less formal principles than in Mediterranean commerce. The monsoon winds created a seasonal rhythm that merchants had to accommodate. During certain months, winds blew from the northeast, making travel from the Persian Gulf toward India relatively straightforward. During other months, winds reversed, making the same journey extraordinarily difficult or impossible. Merchants learned to predict these wind patterns with remarkable accuracy, timing their departures to coincide with favourable conditions. A merchant arriving at Hormuz during an unfavourable wind season might wait weeks or months for conditions to improve. This waiting period created opportunities for merchants to conduct local business, repair ships, and engage in speculative trading. The seasonal rhythm meant that certain times of year saw intense activity in these ports, while other periods experienced reduced commerce. The merchant communities in Aden and Hormuz reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Indian Ocean trade. Arab merchants dominated the local trading networks, yet Persian, Indian, and eventually European merchants maintained significant operations. These communities coexisted with less formal separation than in Alexandria. The merchant quarters were less rigidly defined, and religious boundaries seemed more permeable. This greater integration reflected the reality that these ports served primarily as transshipment points rather than as permanent residences for merchant families. Merchants typically remained in these ports for shorter periods than in Alexandria, conducting their business and departing. The temporary nature of residence meant that elaborate community structures developed less completely than in ports where merchants maintained permanent establishments. Slavery in these southern ports operated on a larger scale than in Mediterranean commerce. The Indian Ocean slave trade transported enslaved people from East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and occasionally from Asia toward markets in the Middle East and beyond. Aden and Hormuz functioned as major slave markets where merchants purchased enslaved people for labour or for resale. The volume of enslaved people passing through these ports exceeded the numbers in Mediterranean commerce by substantial margins. Enslaved people worked on ships, in warehouses, in households, and in agricultural production. The slave trade represented a significant portion of the commercial activity in these ports, though it received less attention from contemporary chroniclers than spice commerce. The relationship between merchant interests and political authority operated differently in these southern ports than in Mediterranean commerce. The rulers of Aden and Hormuz depended almost entirely on taxation of commerce for their revenue. They could not easily disrupt trade without destroying their own economic base. This created a different dynamic than in Crusader Acre, where military objectives sometimes overrode commercial considerations. Aden's rulers understood that excessive taxation would drive merchants toward alternative ports. Hormuz's rulers faced similar constraints. This economic interdependence meant that merchants possessed greater leverage in negotiating with political authorities than they did in Mediterranean ports controlled by military powers. The Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean at the end of the 15th century transformed these established trading networks. Portuguese ships appeared off the coast of India, seeking to establish direct trade routes that would bypass the middlemen controlling Aden and Hormuz. The Portuguese possessed superior naval technology and military capabilities that allowed them to challenge the established order. Merchants who had operated according to established rules for centuries suddenly faced competition from a new power willing to use force to reshape trade patterns. The competition for port control did not cease with the Portuguese arrival. It merely entered a new phase where European powers began competing with established Muslim and Arab merchants for dominance of Indian Ocean commerce. Calicut, on the Malabar coast of India, emerged as the primary source of pepper during the medieval period, a position that generated extraordinary wealth for the local ruler known as the Zamarin. The city's harbour provided excellent shelter for merchant vessels, and the surrounding region produced pepper in quantities that exceeded all other known sources. Merchants from across the Indian Ocean converged on Calicut seeking to purchase pepper directly from producers rather than acquiring it through middlemen in Aden or Hormuz. This direct access to the source created competitive advantages for merchants willing to undertake the longer voyage to India. The Zamarin understood the value of his position and constructed a sophisticated administrative system to extract maximum revenue from the pepper trade while maintaining the security and infrastructure that merchants required. The pepper production system in the hinterland surrounding Calicut involved thousands of cultivators working on small plots of land. Pepper vines required specific growing conditions and careful tending over several years before producing fruit. The harvest occurred during specific seasons, creating annual cycles of intense activity followed by periods of relative inactivity. Merchants learned these cycles and timed their arrivals to coincide with harvest periods when pepper availability peaked. The cultivators sold their pepper to local merchants who consolidated shipments for transport to Calicut's harbour. This multi-layered system meant that pepper passed through numerous hands before reaching foreign merchants, with each intermediary extracting a profit. The Zamarin taxed this commerce at multiple points, collecting fees from cultivators, from local merchants, and from foreign traders. The merchant networks connecting Calicut to the Middle East and Mediterranean world operated through established routes and relationships developed over centuries. Arab merchants dominated this trade, maintaining trading posts in Calicut and other Indian ports. These merchants understood the pepper market intimately, knowing which regions produced the highest quality spices and which merchants could be trusted to deliver consistent supplies. The Arab merchant community in Calicut maintained separate quarters and conducted business according to Islamic law and custom. They served as intermediaries between Indian producers and Mediterranean merchants, extracting substantial profits from their position as middlemen. The Zamarin tolerated this arrangement because Arab merchants brought capital and commercial expertise that benefited the port's economy. Hindu, Muslim, and Christian communities coexisted in Calicut in ways that reflected the port's commercial orientation. The Zamarin himself practiced Hinduism, yet he maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with Muslim rulers throughout the Indian Ocean. Christian merchants from Europe and the Levantine coast conducted business in Calicut, and a Christian community maintained a presence in the city. Jewish merchants participated in Indian Ocean commerce, though their numbers in Calicut remained smaller than in Mediterranean ports. This religious diversity reflected the reality that Calicut functioned primarily as a commercial hub where profit mattered more than religious conformity. Merchants of different faiths competed for access to pepper supplies, yet they also cooperated in maintaining the systems that made commerce possible. The annual negotiation of pepper prices represented a crucial moment in Calicut's commercial calendar. Merchants arriving from distant ports sought to purchase pepper at the lowest possible prices. Local producers and the Zamarin sought to maximize prices. These negotiations occurred in the marketplace, where merchants gathered to assess supplies and discuss terms. The price ultimately agreed upon reflected the balance of power between buyers and sellers. During years of abundant pepper production, prices fell as supply exceeded demand. During years of scarcity, prices rose dramatically. Merchants who correctly predicted price movements could accumulate substantial profits through speculation. A merchant purchasing pepper when prices were low could store it and sell when prices rose, capturing the difference as profit. Women participated in Calicut's pepper trade through family enterprises in ways that sometimes granted them significant economic authority. Wives of wealthy merchants sometimes managed trading operations during their husbands' absences on long voyages. Widows occasionally inherited trading rights and operated independently as merchants in their own right. Women worked as intermediaries between producers and merchants, gathering pepper from cultivators and organizing shipments for transport to the harbor. The most economically vulnerable women worked as laborers in the pepper processing facilities, sorting and preparing pepper for shipment. Gender did not prevent participation in commerce, but it determined the types of work available and the compensation received for that work. The local banking systems that developed in Calicut allowed merchants to conduct commerce without physically transporting large quantities of precious metals. A merchant arriving with gold or silver could deposit funds with a local banker and receive a letter of credit redeemable in another port. This system reduced the risk of theft during long voyages and allowed merchants to conduct larger transactions than they could manage with physical currency. The bankers extracted fees for these services, creating a profitable business alongside their merchant activities. The existence of banking systems meant that Calicut functioned not merely as a marketplace for pepper, but as a financial center where credit relationships extended throughout the Indian Ocean trading world. Portuguese arrival in Indian waters in 1498, under Vasco da Gama's command, initiated a transformation of Calicut's commercial position. The Portuguese possessed superior naval technology and military capabilities that allowed them to challenge the established trading networks. Portuguese ships carried cannons and other weapons that gave them advantages in combat against merchant vessels and coastal fortifications. The Portuguese sought to establish direct trade routes connecting Europe to India, bypassing the middlemen in Aden, Hormuz, and other intermediary ports. This disruption threatened the existing merchant networks that had operated for centuries. Arab merchants who had dominated Indian Ocean trade faced competition from a new power willing to use military force to reshape commerce. The Zamarin's initial response to Portuguese arrival reflected the commercial logic that had guided his predecessors. He recognized that Portuguese merchants brought capital and access to European markets. The Zamarin granted Portuguese merchants permission to establish a trading post in Calicut, expecting to extract taxes from their operations as he did from Arab merchants. This accommodation reflected the assumption that Portuguese merchants would operate according to established rules of commerce. The Zamarin did not anticipate that the Portuguese intended to monopolize pepper trade through military force, rather than competing within existing commercial networks. The Portuguese began attacking Arab merchant ships and attempting to prevent Indian merchants from trading with anyone except Portuguese traders. The resistance to Portuguese monopoly attempts emerged from multiple quarters. Arab merchants, facing displacement from trade networks they had dominated for centuries, organized resistance. Local merchants and the Zamarin himself recognized that Portuguese monopoly would reduce their revenues and their autonomy. The Zamarin attempted to limit Portuguese access to pepper supplies, but Portuguese military superiority made enforcement difficult. Portuguese ships attacked Calicut's harbour facilities, demonstrating their willingness to use force against the port itself. The Zamarin could not match Portuguese naval capabilities with his own forces, yet he refused to accept complete Portuguese dominance. This conflict between the Zamarin and Portuguese merchants created instability that disrupted commerce and reduced profits for all parties. The transformation of Calicut from a port where multiple merchant communities competed relatively peacefully into a contested zone where military power determined commercial access represented a fundamental shift in how Indian Ocean trade operated. The established system had allowed merchants of different nationalities and religions to coexist and compete according to commercial logic. The Portuguese introduced a different model based on military monopoly and the exclusion of competitors. Merchants who had operated according to established rules for centuries suddenly faced competition from a power willing to use force to reshape trade patterns. Calicut's experience revealed something fundamental about ports and power. They were not merely economic entities, they were political structures, and their architecture, both physical and administrative, determined who prospered and who suffered. Fortification design in medieval ports reflected military logic, developed through centuries of siege warfare and naval combat. The Crusaders who controlled Acre constructed walls with specific geometric properties that maximized defensive advantages. Bastions positioned at regular intervals allowed defenders to direct fire along the wall's entire length, eliminating blind spots where attackers could shelter. The walls themselves incorporated angles rather than straight lines, creating surfaces that deflected projectiles and prevented attackers from establishing stable siege equipment. These design principles represented accumulated knowledge about how to defend against assault, knowledge that spread through military networks and influenced fortification construction across the Mediterranean and beyond. The customs houses functioned as administrative centres where bureaucratic control over commerce concentrated. These buildings occupied prominent locations within port districts, visible to all merchants entering the harbour. The architectural prominence communicated the authorities' power to regulate commerce and extract revenue. Within the customs house, scribes maintained detailed records of all goods passing through the port. These records served multiple purposes simultaneously. They documented tax collection, allowing administrators to verify that officials were not embezzling revenue. They tracked commodity flows, providing information about which goods were abundant and which were scarce. They created historical records that rulers could consult to understand their port's economic performance over time. Warehouse systems organized the storage of goods according to commodity type and ownership. Large warehouses constructed near the docks provided secure storage for merchants' merchandise. The warehouse design reflected the need to protect goods from theft, weather damage, and spoilage. Thick walls and sturdy roofs provided protection from the elements. Multiple locks and guards prevented unauthorized access. The warehouse organization created hierarchies among merchants based on their access to prime storage locations. A wealthy merchant with long-standing relationships with port authorities could secure warehouse space near the docks, minimizing transportation costs. A merchant with less influence might receive storage space farther from the harbour, requiring additional labour to move goods between warehouse and ship. The dock design itself reflected careful consideration of labour efficiency and security. Docks were constructed with specific dimensions that allowed ships to approach closely enough for cargo transfer while maintaining sufficient distance to prevent unauthorized boarding. Loading equipment, including cranes and pulleys, concentrated at specific locations where they could be guarded and maintained. The dock layout created bottlenecks where all cargo necessarily passed through, allowing authorities to monitor and tax all commerce. The physical arrangement of docks meant that merchants could not bypass official channels to conduct private transactions. The architecture itself enforced compliance with commercial regulations. Water systems represented critical infrastructure that determined a port's capacity to sustain population and commerce. Ports required fresh water for drinking, cooking, and industrial processes. Some ports, like Alexandria, benefited from nearby rivers that provided abundant fresh water. Others, like Aden, faced severe water scarcity that limited population size and required careful management of available supplies. The Crusaders in Acre invested heavily in developing underground cisterns and wells, recognizing that water security determined whether the city could withstand siege. The location and capacity of water systems influenced military strategy, as controlling them provided advantages in conflict situations. Defenders understood that enemies seeking to starve a city of water could force surrender without requiring direct military assault. Prison facilities within port cities served multiple functions in the commercial system. Merchants who defaulted on debts could be imprisoned until they satisfied their obligations or their creditors agreed to release them. Enslaved people, awaiting sale or transport to distant markets, occupied separate facilities. Criminals convicted of theft or violence faced imprisonment as punishment. The existence of prisons meant that authorities could enforce commercial contracts through the threat of incarceration. A merchant considering fraud understood that failure to deliver promised goods could result in imprisonment. This threat of legal punishment created incentives for honest dealing that supplemented the reputation mechanisms merchants relied upon. Religious buildings within port cities served functions beyond spiritual devotion. Mosques, churches, and synagogues occupied prominent locations within merchant quarters, marking the boundaries between different communities. The architectural prominence of these buildings communicated the authorities' tolerance for religious diversity, at least to the extent that diversity served commercial purposes. Yet these buildings also served as symbols of power. A ruler constructing a grand mosque or church demonstrated commitment to particular religious communities and extracted prestige from these associations. The maintenance of multiple religious buildings required resources, yet rulers accepted these costs because religious infrastructure supported merchant communities that generated tax revenue. The design of fortifications reflected evolving military technology and tactical understanding. Early medieval fortifications featured simple walls with minimal defensive features. As siege technology improved, fortification design became more sophisticated. Crusader fortifications in Acre incorporated multiple layers of walls, bastions, and towers designed to withstand increasingly powerful siege weapons. The fortifications required constant maintenance and upgrading as military technology advanced. A fortification that provided adequate defense against medieval siege equipment might prove inadequate against cannons. This technological arms race meant that rulers who controlled ports faced constant pressure to invest in fortification, improvements, or risk losing their ports to more militarily advanced competitors. Underground storage facilities served multiple purposes in port administration. Some underground spaces stored goods requiring protection from light and temperature fluctuations. Other underground facilities housed prison cells, armories, or administrative offices. The existence of underground infrastructure meant that port authorities could conduct operations hidden from public view. Merchants could not easily determine what goods were being stored underground or what activities occurred in these hidden spaces. This opacity created opportunities for corruption, as officials could claim that goods had been stored underground when they had actually been stolen or diverted. Yet the opacity also served security purposes, as enemies attacking the port could not easily determine the location of critical supplies or administrative centres. Sanitation systems in crowded ports required careful management to prevent disease outbreaks that could devastate populations. Waste disposal systems channeled human waste away from living areas, drainage systems prevented water from accumulating in areas where disease-carrying insects bred. The maintenance of sanitation systems required resources and administrative oversight. Ports with poor sanitation experienced higher mortality rates and difficulty attracting merchants and labourers. Ports with well-maintained sanitation systems attracted larger populations and supported more intensive commercial activity. The relationship between sanitation and commercial success meant that rulers understood maintaining public health as an investment in their port's economic performance. The architecture of control extended beyond physical structures to include administrative procedures and legal frameworks. Customs officials followed established procedures for inspecting cargo, assessing taxes, and recording transactions. These procedures created consistency that merchants could anticipate and plan around. A merchant arriving at a port knew approximately how long inspection would require and what taxes would be assessed. This predictability reduced uncertainty and allowed merchants to conduct business more efficiently than if procedures varied arbitrarily. Yet the procedures also created opportunities for officials to extract unofficial payments through selective enforcement or deliberate delays. The architecture of control thus served multiple purposes simultaneously, facilitating commerce while enabling extraction of wealth through both official and unofficial channels. Acre's final fall to Mamluk forces in 1291 demonstrated how completely a port's fortunes could reverse when military circumstances shifted. The Crusaders had maintained control of the city for nearly 2 centuries through superior military organization and access to resources from Europe. Yet by the late 13th century, the balance of power had shifted decisively against them. The Mamluks controlled Egypt and the Levantine coast, possessing military capabilities that exceeded Crusader strength. When the Mamluks launched their final assault on Acre, the Crusader garrison could not withstand the assault. The city fell after a siege lasting weeks, and the Crusader presence in the Holy Land effectively ended. The conquest transformed Acre from a Christian stronghold into a Muslim port, and the merchant communities that had operated under Crusader rule faced immediate uncertainty about their future. The economic networks that had functioned under Crusader administration collapsed rapidly following the conquest. Venetian and Genoese merchants who had maintained trading posts in Acre for generations suddenly found their positions untenable. The new Mamluk authorities viewed European merchants with suspicion, recognizing them as representatives of the Christian powers that had challenged Muslim dominance for centuries. Some merchants attempted to negotiate with the new authorities, seeking to continue their commercial operations under Mamluk rule. Others recognized that their position had become impossible and departed hastily, transporting whatever merchandise they could salvage. The speed of departure meant that many merchants abandoned substantial property and inventory, accepting losses rather than remaining in a city where their safety could not be guaranteed. The destruction of infrastructure during the siege and conquest created immediate problems for commerce. Fortifications damaged during the assault required repair before the harbour could function safely. Warehouses destroyed by fire or military action meant that merchants could not store goods securely. Docks damaged during combat required reconstruction before ships could load and unload cargo. The Mamluk authorities recognized that restoring these facilities required investment of resources and time. Yet they also understood that delay in restoring harbour operations meant lost tax revenue. The Mamluks therefore invested in reconstruction, though the pace of restoration remained slower than merchants would have preferred. The disruption lasted months, during which commerce through Acre declined dramatically. The merchant communities dispersed to other ports in response to the changed circumstances. Some Venetian merchants relocated to other Mediterranean ports, where their position remained secure. Others moved to ports in the Levantine coast that remained under Crusader or friendly control. A few merchants remained in Acre, adapting to Mamluk rule and attempting to rebuild their trading networks. The dispersal of merchant communities meant that the commercial networks that had concentrated in Acre fragmented. Information that previously flowed through Acre's merchant quarter now moved through multiple ports. The loss of centralization reduced Acre's importance in Mediterranean commerce, though the port never completely ceased functioning. Enslaved populations experienced conquest with particular vulnerability. Enslaved people held by crusader merchants or military orders faced uncertain futures as their owners fled or were killed. Some enslaved people were captured by Mamluk forces and incorporated into Mamluk military or commercial operations. Others found themselves without owners in the chaos of conquest, facing the possibility of starvation or recapture. The conquest disrupted the slave markets that had functioned in Acre, though the Mamluks maintained their own slave trading systems. The transition from Crusader to Mamluk rule meant that enslaved people experienced changes in their conditions and their prospects, though their fundamental status as enslaved persons remained unchanged. Religious persecution following military victory created additional disruption. The Mamluks viewed the Christian conquest of Acre as a religious transgression that required correction. They demolished or converted Christian churches, removing visible symbols of Christian presence. Christian merchants who remained in Acre faced restrictions on their religious practices and their commercial activities. Some Christian merchants converted to Islam to improve their position, though conversion did not guarantee acceptance or security. Jewish merchants, occupying an ambiguous position between Christian and Muslim communities, faced their own uncertainties about their future under Mamluk rule. The religious transformation of the city meant that the invisible boundaries that had organized merchant communities under Crusader rule required redrawing under Mamluk authority. The refugee flows from Acre created pressures on other Mediterranean ports. Merchants arriving from Acre brought news of the conquest and information about Mamluk intentions. Other ports received warnings that Mamluk expansion might threaten their own positions. Some ports responded by strengthening their fortifications and military garrisons. Others attempted to negotiate with Mamluk authorities, seeking assurances that their ports would not face assault. The conquest of Acre created ripples of uncertainty throughout Mediterranean commerce, as merchants and rulers attempted to understand what the Mamluk victory meant for the future of Christian-Muslim relations in the region. The Portuguese conquest of Hormuz in 1507 demonstrated how conquest patterns repeated across centuries and regions. Portuguese ships arrived at Hormuz possessing superior naval technology and military capabilities. The local ruler attempted to resist Portuguese demands for control of the port, yet Portuguese military superiority proved decisive. The Portuguese conquered the city through military assault, establishing direct control over this critical choke point in Persian Gulf trade. The conquest disrupted the existing merchant networks that had operated through Hormuz for centuries. Arab merchants who had dominated Gulf trade faced displacement or subordination to Portuguese authority. The Portuguese established a fortress and military garrison, transforming Hormuz from a merchant-dominated port into a military stronghold. The Ottoman conquest of Aden in 1538 followed similar patterns of military conquest and commercial disruption. Ottoman forces arrived with superior military capabilities and the intention to establish Ottoman control over Red Sea trade. The local rulers resisted, yet Ottoman military strength proved overwhelming. The conquest transformed Aden from an independent port into an Ottoman possession. The existing merchant networks that had operated through Aden faced disruption as Ottoman authorities implemented new commercial policies. Some merchants adapted to Ottoman rule and continued operating in the port. Others relocated to ports outside Ottoman control. The conquest meant that Aden's commercial importance shifted as Ottoman policies redirected trade flows toward Ottoman-controlled ports. The destruction of infrastructure during conquest operations created immediate economic damage. Ships in harbour during conquest risked capture or destruction. Warehouses containing merchandise faced destruction by military forces. Docks and harbour facilities suffered damage from military operations. The destruction meant that merchants lost merchandise, ships, and access to stored goods. The financial losses from conquest could bankrupt merchants who had invested heavily in particular ports. The uncertainty about whether destroyed infrastructure would be repaired meant that merchants hesitated to reinvest in ports that had recently experienced conquest. This hesitation delayed economic recovery and prolonged the disruption to commerce. The reconstruction of ports following conquest required investment by new authorities. The Mamluks invested in restoring Acre's harbour facilities because they recognized the port's commercial value. The Portuguese invested in fortifying Hormuz because they sought to maintain military control and extract revenue from commerce. The Ottomans invested in Aden because they understood its strategic importance. Yet the reconstruction often reflected the new authorities' priorities rather than the preferences of merchants. A port reconstructed according to military logic might function less efficiently for commerce than it had under merchant-dominated administration. Merchants adapted to these new arrangements, though adaptation sometimes meant accepting lower profits and reduced autonomy than they had experienced under previous regimes. Yet collapse was not the end of these ports. Survivors adapted, systems were rebuilt, and new networks formed. The individual merchant faced a choice: flee, resist, or accommodate the new order. When Portuguese ships appeared off the coast of Calicut, merchants faced immediate decisions about how to respond to this new competitive threat. Some merchants recognized that Portuguese military capabilities posed a genuine danger to their established trading networks and chose to flee to ports where Portuguese power had not yet extended. These merchants relocated their families and transferred their capital to safer locations, accepting the losses associated with abandoning established operations. Other merchants chose to remain and attempt negotiation with Portuguese commanders, hoping that accommodation might allow them to continue commerce under new conditions. Still others adopted a strategy of resistance, organizing with other merchants to oppose Portuguese monopoly attempts through collective action. Each choice carried distinct consequences, and merchants made these decisions under conditions of profound uncertainty about what Portuguese dominance would ultimately mean for their livelihoods. The decision to flee represented an acknowledgement that resistance would prove futile and that remaining in a conquered port would expose merchants and their families to unacceptable risks. A merchant with sufficient capital could relocate to another port where his reputation and trading networks remained intact. The relocation required transporting merchandise, settling accounts with creditors, and establishing new operations in a different location. The process consumed time and resources, yet merchants who relocated successfully could resume commerce within months. The merchants who fled Acre in 1291 relocated to other Mediterranean ports, where their Venetian or Genoese identity remained an asset rather than a liability. Some merchants established themselves in Cyprus, which remained under Christian control. Others relocated to ports in southern Italy or the Balkans, where they could rebuild their trading networks. The decision to accommodate new authorities represented a different calculation. A merchant choosing this path recognized that Portuguese or Mamluk rule might offer opportunities for profit despite the disruption to existing networks. A merchant with flexibility and willingness to adapt could potentially prosper under new circumstances. This approach required accepting reduced autonomy and acknowledging that political authorities would extract greater revenues than they had under previous regimes. Yet accommodation also offered the advantage of continuity. A merchant remaining in a conquered port could maintain relationships with local suppliers and customers. The merchant's knowledge of local conditions and existing networks represented valuable assets that could not be easily replicated elsewhere. Religious conversion sometimes served as a strategy for accommodation. A Christian merchant in a port conquered by Muslim forces might convert to Islam to improve his position and reduce suspicion from new authorities. Conversion granted access to Muslim trading networks and credit relationships that remained closed to non-believers. Conversion also simplified legal relationships with Muslim authorities and reduced the restrictions on movement and commerce. Some merchants converted sincerely, finding genuine spiritual meaning in their adopted faith. Others maintained private adherence to their original religion, while publicly observing the requirements of their adopted faith. The motivations varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Religious identity carried economic consequences that merchants sometimes chose to modify when circumstances made conversion advantageous. The decision to resist represented the most dangerous choice, yet some merchants pursued this path despite the risks. Merchants who organized collective resistance against Portuguese monopoly attempts recognized that individual accommodation would ultimately result in displacement. By resisting collectively, merchants hoped to preserve their autonomy and their share of commerce. The resistance took multiple forms. Some merchants organized boycotts of Portuguese traders, refusing to conduct business with them. Others coordinated with local rulers to oppose Portuguese military operations. Still others engaged in smuggling, attempting to circumvent Portuguese monopoly by conducting trade through alternative routes. These resistance efforts sometimes succeeded in limiting Portuguese control, though they never completely prevented Portuguese expansion into Indian Ocean commerce. The maintenance of family networks across political boundaries represented a crucial survival strategy. A merchant family with members in multiple ports could relocate capital and merchandise between locations as circumstances changed. If one port fell under hostile control, the family could shift operations to another port where relatives maintained trading posts. This geographic diversification reduced the risk that conquest of a single port would destroy the entire family enterprise. Merchants understood this principle and deliberately established family members in different ports to create redundancy. A father might place one son in Alexandria, another in Aden, and a third in Calicut. If conquest disrupted operations in one location, the family could continue commerce through the other ports and eventually rebuild operations in the conquered port once circumstances stabilized. The moral compromises required for survival under new regimes created psychological burdens that merchants carried throughout their lives. A merchant who collaborated with conquerors might face accusations of betrayal from merchants who fled or resisted. A merchant who converted to Islam might experience internal conflict about abandoning his original faith. A merchant who profited from slavery or other exploitative practices might experience guilt about the suffering of those he exploited. Yet survival often required accepting these moral compromises. A merchant who refused to collaborate with conquerors might face imprisonment or death. A merchant who refused to adapt to new commercial realities might lose his livelihood. The pressure to survive created situations where merchants chose actions they might have considered unacceptable under different circumstances. The adaptation of business practices to new rulers sometimes involved fundamental changes in how merchants conducted commerce. Under Crusader rule in Acre, Christian merchants enjoyed advantages in accessing certain markets and obtaining favorable tax treatment. Under Mamluk rule, Muslim merchants enjoyed these advantages. A merchant adapting to Mamluk rule might shift his trading networks to emphasize Muslim business partners and reduce his reliance on Christian merchants. This shift required developing new relationships and learning new business practices. Yet merchants possessed sufficient flexibility to make these adaptations. A merchant who had successfully navigated multiple political regimes understood that business practices required adjustment to accommodate new circumstances. The credit relationships that merchants maintained across political boundaries sometimes persisted despite conquest and conflict. A merchant who owed money to a creditor in a different port might continue servicing that debt even after conquest disrupted direct communication. The creditor, recognizing that disruption was temporary and that commerce would eventually resume, sometimes accepted delayed payments or modified terms. These credit relationships represented valuable assets that both parties sought to preserve. A merchant who defaulted on debts during conquest might find that creditors pursued collection aggressively once circumstances stabilized. The persistence of credit relationships across political boundaries meant that merchants maintained incentives to resume commerce, even after disruption. The experience of conquest created trauma that affected merchants' subsequent decision-making. A merchant who experienced conquest firsthand understood viscerally the vulnerability of merchant communities to military force. This experience sometimes motivated merchants to invest more heavily in fortifications and military capabilities. Other merchants responded by becoming more conservative, avoiding ports that seemed vulnerable to conquest. Still others responded by becoming more aggressive in pursuing profit, recognizing that circumstances could change suddenly and that accumulating wealth quickly represented a rational strategy. The psychological impact of conquest varied among merchants, but the experience generally reinforced the understanding that merchant autonomy depended on military circumstances beyond their control. The individual choices of thousands of merchants, multiplied across centuries and regions, created patterns that revealed something fundamental about how the medieval world functioned. These patterns transcended individual politics or warfare. They reflected structural realities about how commerce operated and how geography determined power. Understanding these patterns required examining not merely individual merchants, but the systems within which they operated. Logistics determined the viability of these systems, and geography determined logistics. Geography determined which ports dominated medieval commerce, not through cultural superiority or moral virtue, but through the simple reality of logistics. Alexandria's position at the Nile mouth made it the natural collection point for goods flowing from the African interior. Aden's location at the Red Sea entrance made it an inevitable stopping point for merchants traveling between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Hormuz's position, controlling the Persian Gulf entrance, created an unavoidable choke point through which all Gulf commerce necessarily flowed. These geographic advantages could not be replicated or overcome through superior organization or greater effort. A merchant seeking to trade with India could not simply choose an alternative route that avoided these ports. The monsoon winds, ocean currents, and coastline configurations created a geography that determined where commerce could efficiently flow. The monsoon wind patterns that governed Indian Ocean commerce created a seasonal rhythm that merchants learned to anticipate with remarkable precision. During certain months, winds blew from the northeast, making travel from the Persian Gulf toward India relatively straightforward. During other months, winds reversed, making the same journey extraordinarily difficult or impossible. A merchant departing Hormuz during an unfavorable wind season might require months to reach India, consuming supplies and increasing costs substantially. A merchant departing during a favorable wind season might complete the same journey in weeks. This difference between favorable and unfavorable seasons meant that merchants concentrated their voyages during specific months when conditions permitted efficient travel. The seasonal concentration created predictable patterns of commerce that rulers could anticipate and plan around. The supply chain fragility created by geographic concentration meant that disruption at a single critical point could cascade through the entire system. If Aden fell under hostile control and refused to allow merchants to resupply, merchants traveling from the Mediterranean to India would face extraordinary difficulties. They could attempt to bypass Aden by traveling around the Arabian Peninsula, yet this alternative route required additional time and exposed ships to greater risks. The lack of viable alternatives meant that whoever controlled Aden possessed leverage over all merchants seeking to trade between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. This leverage translated into political power and economic wealth. A ruler controlling Aden could extract taxes from merchants who possessed no practical alternative to using the port. The distance between ports created communication delays that affected merchant decision-making. A merchant in Alexandria, learning of a pepper shortage in Europe, could not immediately arrange for increased shipments from India. The information about the shortage would take months to reach India through merchant networks. By the time Indian merchants received the information and arranged for increased pepper production and shipment, months or years might have passed. The delay meant that merchants could not respond to market changes as quickly as modern commerce allows. Instead, merchants relied on speculation and prediction. A merchant who correctly predicted that pepper prices would rise could purchase pepper when prices were low and store it until prices increased. The merchant who predicted incorrectly would lose money on the speculation. Weather and maritime risk created constant threats to commerce that merchants could not eliminate through superior planning. Ships sank in storms despite the skill of their crews. Cargoes spoiled despite careful storage. Merchants lost merchandise to pirates despite travelling in convoys. These risks were inherent to maritime commerce and could not be completely eliminated. Merchants responded by developing insurance mechanisms that allowed them to distribute risk across multiple parties. A merchant who lost a ship to a storm could receive compensation from an insurance fund that had accumulated contributions from many merchants. This risk distribution allowed merchants to undertake longer voyages and larger shipments than they could manage if they had to absorb all losses individually. Resource scarcity in certain regions created political consequences that merchants could not control. Pepper originated in specific regions of the Indian Ocean and could not be cultivated elsewhere. This geographic monopoly meant that whoever controlled pepper production possessed leverage over merchants seeking to purchase pepper. The Zamorin of Calicut understood this leverage and used it to extract maximum revenue from pepper commerce. The Zamorin could not increase pepper production beyond what the climate and soil allowed, yet he could restrict access to pepper supplies to merchants willing to pay his demanded prices. This restriction created artificial scarcity that benefited the Zamorin and harmed merchants seeking to purchase pepper at lower prices. The military strategy of port control reflected the reality that logistics determined military success. An army seeking to conquer a region required supplies of food, weapons, and equipment. An army that could not obtain these supplies through local sources had to transport them from distant locations. The longer the supply lines, the more vulnerable the army became to disruption. A military commander seeking to conquer a port understood that controlling the port would provide access to supplies that could support military operations. The conquest of Acre provided the Crusaders with access to Mediterranean trade networks that supplied their military forces. The loss of Acre disrupted these supply networks and contributed to the eventual collapse of Crusader power in the Levant. The storage capacity of ports determined how much commerce they could handle. A port with limited warehouse space could not accommodate large shipments of goods. A merchant arriving with a cargo of pepper might find that no warehouse space was available and be forced to either sell the pepper immediately at reduced prices or transport it to another port. The shortage of warehouse space created bottlenecks that limited commerce. Ports that invested in expanding warehouse capacity could accommodate larger volumes of commerce and attract merchants seeking storage services. The investment in warehouse infrastructure represented a commitment to facilitating commerce that generated returns through increased tax revenue. The predictability of supply chains allowed merchants to plan their operations with greater confidence. A merchant understanding that pepper would be available in Calicut during specific months could arrange to be present during those months to purchase supplies. A merchant understanding that monsoon winds would be favourable during specific months could schedule his voyages to coincide with favourable wind periods. This predictability allowed merchants to coordinate their activities across multiple ports and multiple years. A merchant could plan a multi-year trading strategy that relied on specific ports being available at specific times and specific goods being available in specific quantities. The vulnerability of supply chains to disruption created political instability that affected commerce. If a port fell under hostile control and refused to allow merchants to resupply, the entire supply chain could be disrupted. Merchants traveling from the Mediterranean to India depended on Aden and Hormuz to resupply. If both ports fell under hostile control simultaneously, Mediterranean merchants would face extraordinary difficulties in reaching India. This vulnerability meant that merchants had strong incentives to support political stability in critical ports. A merchant might contribute financially to the defense of a port he relied upon, recognizing that the port's fall would disrupt his commerce. The specialization of ports according to their geographic position created interdependence among ports. Alexandria specialized in Mediterranean trade because of its position on the Mediterranean coast. Aden specialized in Red Sea trade because of its position at the Red Sea entrance. Calicut specialized in pepper trade because of its position near pepper production regions. This specialization meant that ports served different functions within the larger trading system. A merchant seeking to trade between Europe and India had to utilize multiple ports, each serving a specific function in the supply chain. The interdependence meant that disruption at any critical point could cascade through the entire system. The 5 ports examined tonight, Alexandria, Acre, Aden, Hormuz, and Calicut, occupied positions in a global supply chain that connected continents, religions, and centuries. Their rise and fall followed patterns that transcended individual politics or warfare. They reflected structural realities about how commerce operated and how geography determined power. Understanding these 5 mechanisms reveals truths about how authority operates, how it fractures, and why certain locations matter more than others in determining the fate of nations and peoples. These ports were not exceptional. They were nodes in a network that connected the medieval world into an integrated system where the actions of merchants in one port affected merchants in distant ports months or years later. The trade routes that connected these 5 ports persisted across centuries, despite political upheaval and military conquest. When Acre fell to Mamluk forces, Mediterranean merchants did not abandon commerce with the Levant. Instead, they adapted their operations to accommodate Mamluk rule. When Portuguese ships disrupted Indian Ocean trade, Arab merchants did not cease their operations. Instead, they relocated to ports outside Portuguese control and continued trading through alternative routes. The fundamental demand for spices, silks, and other luxury goods remained constant regardless of which political authority controlled particular ports. This constancy meant that merchants found ways to continue commerce even when circumstances changed dramatically. The routes themselves proved more durable than the political systems that governed them. Merchant networks maintained coherence across conquest and political disruption through the persistence of family relationships and kinship ties. A merchant family with members in multiple ports could maintain communication and coordinate activities even when direct contact between ports became difficult. A Venetian merchant family with relatives in Alexandria, Acre, and Venice could continue conducting business through family members even if political circumstances prevented direct travel between certain ports. The family network functioned as a communication system that transmitted information about market conditions, political changes, and commercial opportunities. This information allowed merchants to adjust their strategies in response to changing circumstances. A family learning that Portuguese ships had disrupted Indian Ocean trade could redirect their operations toward Mediterranean commerce or toward ports outside Portuguese control. Religious and cultural mixing in port cities created lasting patterns that transcended individual ports or political regimes. The merchant communities that coexisted in Alexandria under Crusader rule, Mamluk rule, and Ottoman rule developed hybrid practices that combined elements from multiple religious and cultural traditions. A Christian merchant conducting business with Muslim partners learned Arabic and became familiar with Islamic commercial law. A Muslim merchant working with Jewish partners learned Hebrew and became familiar with Jewish legal traditions. These merchants developed cultural competence that allowed them to operate effectively across religious boundaries. The cultural competence they developed was transmitted to their children and their business partners, creating layers of cultural understanding that persisted across generations. Knowledge transfer between ports created technological and commercial innovations that spread throughout the trading world. Navigation techniques developed in one port were transmitted to merchants in other ports through merchant networks and traveling scholars. A merchant learning of a new navigation technique in Alexandria could transmit that knowledge to relatives in Venice, who could transmit it to merchants in other Mediterranean ports. Ship design innovations developed by shipbuilders in one port influenced shipbuilders in other ports. The exchange of knowledge meant that technological advances did not remain localized, but spread through merchant networks to benefit merchants across the entire trading system. This knowledge transfer created a form of technological diffusion that accelerated the pace of innovation. Technology adoption and adaptation reflected the practical needs of merchants operating in different environments. A navigation technique that worked well in Mediterranean waters might require modification to work effectively in Indian Ocean conditions. A ship design that functioned well in relatively calm Mediterranean harbours might require modification to withstand the storms of the Indian Ocean. Merchants and shipbuilders adapted technologies to local conditions, creating variations that reflected the specific challenges of different regions. This adaptive process meant that technology did not simply transfer unchanged from one region to another, but evolved as merchants and craftspeople modified it to suit their circumstances. The merchant family networks that persisted across centuries created institutional memory about trading practices, market conditions, and political relationships. A merchant family that had conducted business for generations accumulated knowledge about which suppliers could be trusted, which routes were safest, which ports offered the best terms, and which political authorities were most reliable. This institutional memory represented valuable knowledge that could not be easily replicated by newcomers to commerce. A merchant family could leverage this accumulated knowledge to gain advantages over competitors who lacked similar experience. The persistence of merchant families across centuries meant that some families maintained trading networks that had functioned for generations, creating competitive advantages based on accumulated experience and relationships. The recipes and culinary traditions that travelled through merchant networks reflected the cultural exchange that occurred in port cities. Merchants encountering unfamiliar foods in distant ports sometimes adopted them and transmitted them to their home regions. Spices from India transformed Mediterranean cuisine as merchants introduced them to European markets. Techniques for preparing foods travelled through merchant networks, with cooks learning methods from merchants who had travelled to distant regions. The culinary exchange reflected broader patterns of cultural diffusion that occurred through commerce. Merchants served as vectors for cultural transmission, carrying not merely goods, but also knowledge, techniques, and practices from one region to another. Architectural styles influenced by port cities spread through merchant networks and military campaigns. The fortification designs developed by crusaders in Acre influenced fortification construction in other Mediterranean ports. The dome architecture common in Islamic ports influenced Christian architects who worked in Mediterranean cities. The warehouse designs that proved effective in one port were copied in other ports, seeking to improve their commercial infrastructure. These architectural influences reflected the exchange of practical knowledge about how to construct buildings that functioned effectively for commerce and defense. The architectural heritage of medieval ports remained visible in cities that continued functioning as commercial centers into the modern era. The language borrowing that occurred through merchant networks created linguistic legacies that persisted across centuries. Merchants conducting business in multiple languages developed hybrid vocabularies that combined elements from different languages. Trade terminology from Arabic, Italian, Greek, and other languages mixed together in merchant communications. These hybrid vocabularies reflected the multilingual reality of merchant communities. Words borrowed from one language into another sometimes persisted even after the original context of borrowing had disappeared. A word borrowed from Arabic into Italian to describe a particular spice might continue being used in Italian centuries after the original Arabic context had been forgotten. The artistic and craft traditions that spread through merchant networks created cultural legacies that transcended individual ports. Glassmaking techniques from Alexandria influenced glassmakers in other Mediterranean ports. Textile production methods from India influenced textile producers in the Middle East and Mediterranean regions. Metalworking techniques spread through merchant networks as craftspeople learned from masters in other regions. The spread of craft traditions meant that artistic and technical knowledge accumulated in one region could benefit craftspeople in other regions. A metalworker learning a new technique from a master in a distant port could apply that technique to create objects that reflected the influence of multiple traditions. The financial innovations developed by merchants in one port influenced financial practices in other ports. The banking systems that developed in Alexandria influenced banking practices in other Mediterranean ports. The insurance mechanisms that merchants developed to manage maritime risk spread through merchant networks to other ports. The credit instruments that merchants used to facilitate long-distance commerce were adapted and modified by merchants in other regions. These financial innovations reflected merchants' practical responses to the challenges of conducting commerce across great distances and long time periods. The innovations that proved effective in one context were adopted and adapted in other contexts, creating a gradual evolution of financial practices throughout the trading world. The diplomatic marriages between merchant families and rulers created kinship networks that transcended political boundaries. A merchant family member marrying into a ruling family created connections that could benefit the merchant family's commercial interests. A ruler marrying into a merchant family created connections that could benefit the ruler's access to commercial networks and wealth. These marriages created networks of kinship that persisted across generations and across political changes. A merchant family maintaining kinship ties to ruling families in multiple ports could leverage these relationships to obtain favorable commercial terms or political protection. The kinship networks created through strategic marriages represented valuable assets that merchant families cultivated deliberately. The 5 ports examined tonight, Alexandria, Acre, Aden, Hormuz, and Calicut, were not isolated stories. They were nodes in a network that connected continents, religions, and centuries. Their rise and fall followed patterns that transcended individual politics or warfare. They reflected structural realities about how commerce operated and how geography determined power. The connections that these ports facilitated persisted even when individual ports fell under new control or experienced disruption. The merchant networks that operated through these ports adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining the fundamental connections that made commerce possible. The legacy of these ports lay not in their individual histories, but in the patterns they revealed about how human networks function, how commerce connects distant regions, and how geography shapes the possibilities for human interaction across vast distances.